Thank you, Tiffany. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to start out by describing how this talk happened to come about. It'll take about 1 minute, but at the Riordan Clinic, we see ourselves as co-learners with our patients. We learn as much from them as they learn from us, and we try to participate in community health projects. And so this fell into the community health bin, and I brought this up, and we canvassed our doctors, and they were uniformly against fluoridation. And so then, proceeding, I wrote a letter to the editor about this on August the 1st. And I thought it was a rather good letter, of course I would. There's a copy of it that will be attached to these materials, which will be available at the end of the lecture. And I got absolutely no response. I emailed it on the correct address, and I checked my computer, and it says that the message was sent or received, sent and received, and it just says sent. And expected to get a phone call from the editor saying this is too long or this is great or something, but nothing happened, just total silence. So if there's someone here from the Eagle today, I welcome you and hope you'll listen closely. Now, this is a contentious subject, and there are people on both sides of the issue. And at the end of this lecture, I will open the podium up, or at least I'll open up to questions from the audience. I do not want political rants. You'll have 3 minutes maximum. If you get overtime or you're trying to express an opinion and not ask a question, you'll get the hook. So let's stay on task. Now then, can you all see that? Okay. This is the beginning of the letter that I sent in to the Eagle. And there is a key thought in here, and that is that if fluoridation of community water supplies does not reduce decay, there's no sense in worrying about other side effects. We wouldn't want to put it in our water because it's ineffective and thus very expensive. So, and then the second issue I addressed or talked about was that there are a number of really major side effects from concentrations of fluoride in the water that are quite low. Many of the studies have been done on concentrations less than 1 part per million. But at any rate, those are the two issues we will discuss today, and they were mentioned in the letter. This is a part of it, and there was no response. Now remember, you'll get the full text of these things on your handout later. This is, in that letter I referred to a couple of studies that have been done. One was done starting, I believe it was 1946 in Ottawa, Kansas. And that was the advent, really, the beginning of fluoridation of municipal water supplies. And they did a rather thoughtful study, better than any others that were done at the time. They added fluoride to the city water supply, and at that point, before it was done, they surveyed 100 children, 5- and 6-year-olds, in their school system that had always lived in Ottawa. They had not been exposed to any other sources of community water that had fluoride in them. Then after 5 years, they took a similar group of children, matched them up, but they were 5- and 6-year-olds again, and those kids had been living in Ottawa through that 5-year period of the study, and had all been drinking public water. Lo and behold, there was no difference in the decay rates between the non-fluoridated kids and the fluoridated ones. Now that's the kind of science that we should be seeing in studying fluoridation, but we don't. At about the same time, a survey was done on two cities, and they're shown on this graph. One of the cities was Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the other was Newburgh, New York. Those were the first two cities in the U.S. that added fluoride to their community water. And those kids were compared to the rest of the country. There was some fluoridation elsewhere in the country, but very little, maybe none. And if you look at this graph, without looking at the key, I would question if anybody could look at that graph and say, well, these kids got fluoride and those didn't, because they're identical. There's no difference between all these kids in the whole country that had not been receiving fluoride and the children in Newburgh and Grand Rapids that had been receiving fluoride. So there's just more solid evidence that fluoride doesn't work. Okay, well, you kind of have to ask yourself then, well, how did we get off onto this crazy idea that we've got to add medicine, fluoride, to everybody's water? Actually, in the early 1900s, a study was undertaken by a Dr. McKay in Colorado Springs. He moved there as a young dentist, and he quickly observed that people who'd lived in Colorado Springs all their life had brown teeth. And he noticed that, and he also noted that there was pitting in those teeth, which he referred to as mottling. And he wondered why. So he started working on that project, and he engaged the participation of another fellow whose name I've forgotten. Let's see. In this project. Oops. And they were able to identify the problem as being in the city water supply, but they didn't know what was doing it within that water supply. This information became, and they also suggested that maybe whatever was in there was reducing the rate of decay, tooth decay. So that got the attention of the people at Alcoa Aluminum Company. That's Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa. Remember that because they play a huge role in this whole story. Well, Alcoa in 1931 decided they would study this project. And they enlisted the help, or hired, some, quote, scientists to help them with this study. And the first person they hired was named, he was a trendy, I would say, and they sent him to Texas to study. And what they knew was that there were some communities in Texas that had high rates of decay, some lower, and they were supposed to look at decay rates and fluoride contents in the water supplies. Now, how in the world could Alcoa of America get somebody to study people like that without some governmental backing? Well, it turns out that Trindley Dean had worked in the United States Public Health Service, and the Treasury Secretary of the United States at that time was Andrew W. Mellon. Well, the Mellon family is prominent in Pittsburgh. It's the Mellon Bank, the Mellon everything, and I think they're billionaires still. And Andrew Mellon had appointed a fellow, well, he was the United States Public Health Service was under his wing, his direction, and so he said, well, and he was a major stockholder, of course, in Alcoa, and it was to their benefit to get rid of this expensive waste product. So he appointed Dr. Dean to go down to Texas. We'll come back to some of the results on that. I'm not working. I know, I don't know how to do these things very well. There we go. Wait a second. Okay. There's McKay, and his assistant was Black, a guy named Black. Alcoa at that point and later decided, well, gee, this will help us because we've got this very toxic waste, which is so expensive to dispose of. If we can somehow link that to doing good for people by putting it in the water supply, we'll make a lot more money. And at that time, the position of almost every authority in the world was, don't mess with fluoride, it is tremendously toxic. In fact, fluoride is rated in toxicity along with arsenic and lead. I think it's more toxic than lead and it's just slightly less toxic than arsenic. So anyway, this was one of the Alcoa ads as they were trying to promote fluoride. It was in magazines and newspapers. Then in 1937, Dr. Cox wrote, quote, "It is possible that fluorine is specifically required for the formation of teeth." That he was trying to move fluorides into a essential nutrient category. Then in 1938, this was in the Journal of the American Medical Association, he wrote that there is an optimum amount of fluorine essential for tooth formation. That goes along with his previous stance. And the optimum, of course, is below that which causes mottled enamel. Well, he had no published research at that time, but that's what he said. So people got interested and they started paying attention to it. And then Cox published a study on the tooth decay rate in the offspring of pregnant rats. Now, I know that sounds kind of, but rats are kind of like they're mammals and they have babies and they nurse them and so forth. And at any rate, he added fluoride to their diet. And the graph shows across the top the amount of fluoride added, 0, none. Then the next column is 10, then 20, then 40. Now bear in mind, we think, personally I think any fluoride is bad, but the pro-fluoridationists are trying to set our water supply fluoridation level at 0.7 here in Wichita. So if you look at these numbers, I would defy you again. Show me, without knowing which column is which had the most fluoride in it and which had the least. You'll notice that the one with 20 parts per million actually had 33 cavities. Some summary of the two sites of cavities at 33. That was the highest. At 40, they were down to 22, which is lower than the 0 and the 10. It's just trash science, no statistical significance whatsoever, but this got accepted. People just refused to look at the truth, I guess. I don't know what happened. Okay, then Dr. Dean did a study on the effect of chloride decay rates in 6 different cities, shown here. And on the left column, it shows the increasing concentrations of fluoride. In the middle column, it shows the percent of children with decay-free permanent teeth. And on the far column, you're right, it shows the incidence of fluorosis. T-Mobile? It's okay. On a statistical basis, these figures don't mean anything. But if you look at it, you tend to think, well, maybe the children that were getting more fluoride had fewer decays. Remember on that, what they're showing is the percent of decay-free teeth in that middle column. So where it says 11, the lowest number, that would mean the highest instance of decay. So that got a little bit of attention, but then later, whoops, Doctors Lucy and Bibby re-examined those findings, and they noticed that in the newest study, maybe I don't have that here. No, I don't. At any rate, at East Moline, Illinois, in the repeat studies in the same cities, the East Moline, Illinois people were moved into the high fluoride column because they had the least decays. So in one study they had the most, in the second study the least. Go figure, you know, it doesn't make any sense at all. The one thing this study does support is that the more exposure you have to fluorides, the more trouble you have with fluorosis, which is mottled teeth, white streaks, and then a pitting, and then brown teeth, and then no teeth. That's the progress. I'll talk about that. That's true. Okay. Yeah, this is a study. This was done by Bibby also. This showed, if anything, it showed more decay in the high fluoride areas than in the low fluoride areas. Remember these tables, you're going to get a copy of all these tables. I see everybody just staring up at the screen. Okay. So let's say that there is ample science studies which show that fluoride is not effective in preventing decay. Now, a following study was done again in Texas cities. This is not up there on the board, but they studied two residents, Bartlett, Texas, and Cameron, Texas. These were fairly close to each other, similar populations, similar size, as matched as you could make two little cities, except for one thing, and the difference was the fluoride in the water. Well, it turned out that 8 parts per million fluoride didn't prevent any more cavities than 0.4 parts per million. There was no difference between the decay rate in those two cities. A similar study was done in Arizona by a Dr. Galligan, and his studies surveyed the incidence of tooth decay in kids in several different cities, kind of similar to the previous studies we've seen. And once again, there was no difference in the tooth decay between the fluoridated and non-fluoridated cities. Finally, just to continue this thought, a study was done in Tokyo. The Japanese got interested in fluoridating. And this was the biggest study that I've seen published. They actually 20,000 students from grades 1 through 6. And the finding was that the rates of decay in fluoride concentrations below 0.4 parts per million, that's where Wichita is, those decay rates were less than in the cities above 0.4 parts per million, and those cities went up to 2, as I recall, parts per million natural fluoride. So there's just no science to support the idea that fluoride reduces tooth decay. I think I'll be able to have time to mention another study later on, but at this point I think it might be maybe this reduction in tooth decay, which is occurring throughout the United States and Western Europe, a lot of places, is because of fluoridated toothpaste. Well, that's an issue we haven't totally answered yet, but fluoride. But the point I want to talk about is that fluoride, it turns out, is not incorporated into the enamel of the tooth as it forms, which is what they think happens during pregnancy and the early years of life. Actually, there's no difference in the fluoride content of babies who've been raised on fluoridated water in cities containing that and babies who haven't, who have no exposure to fluoride. So the teeth enamel doesn't have any difference in its fluoride content. You want me?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to just move this up because it keeps going away.
Okay,
So.
I noticed that. Thank you. So what does fluoride do? Well, it may help when applied topically. There are some problems with dental applications in offices, and the dentists normally, I would say, are very careful doing that, but there have been sloppy incidences and actual deaths or acute fluoride poisoning in dental chairs when they're applying the fluoride to your teeth. So it's not an innocuous project. What we think fluoride does is that after decay starts, which the decay starts in scratches on the enamel and basically in an acid environment. And there are two forms of bacteria that are the principal causers of tooth decay: Streptococcus mutans and Lactobacillus acidophilus, acid-loving lactobacilli. So once this crevice is formed, there's a natural tendency to heal the erosion on the enamel, the healing comes through your saliva. People who don't salivate enough have a lot of trouble with tooth decay. And it takes several hours for that healing to occur, which makes the idea of eating all the time rather unattractive, in my opinion. But at any rate, fluoride comes into this picture. Normally with our saliva, there's a calcium ion which is absorbed and forms the enamel called calcium apatite. Well, there's a fluoroapatite compound too, which readily forms, and it forms a veneer apparently on the tooth and over the crevices that could become cavities. So actually, chloride doesn't prevent decay. If it helps at all, it helps heal the cavity. Now, when we talk about fluoride in drinking water, we should look at what's been happening in recent years. Many cities have touted their wisdom in having their water supplies fluoridated because they can show a reducing rate of tooth decay in their children. But lo and behold, the same rate of diminished tooth decay is occurring in non-fluoridated communities and throughout Europe. Almost all the civilized world where there is some dental care and dental awareness present, the rate of tooth decay is going down. And that's where fluoridated toothpaste comes in. Now, you know, or maybe you know, or do you know, how toxic fluoridated toothpaste is? Some people know. Some people say, yeah, I know. Well, at any rate, the recommended dose of fluoride on your toothbrush is the size of a pea. I can remember giving a talk in Denver one time for a different reason, but I was talking about doctors who don't get the message, or they stop thinking after they get out of medical school because they're all alike. And I used a slide that had a toothbrush on it with a strip of toothpaste, and it was covered all the bristles. That's the way I do it. I don't know, I bet most of you do the same thing. Well, you're way over the recommended level of fluoride. But at any rate, my point in Denver was that when we went into medical school, we were all different. I remember looking around a patio at a break time, and I'd wonder, well, how did she get into school? Or what's he doing there, you know? Or I didn't think he made good enough grades, you know. But anyway, we kind of evaluated each other. We were all totally dressed differently, everything. And the same group of guys, before we got sworn in by the Hippocratic Oath at graduation, I looked around and we were all identical. We dressed alike. We all had on our little white, we had to wear white pants and white shirts and white shoes and white open neck or tie. And we all looked exactly alike. We talked alike. We thought alike. And most of those guys never break that mold. That's part of the reasons we get fluoridated water. They just kind of forget how to think, and they follow the dogma that's taught by whoever's teaching. So at any rate, toothpaste anyway is very toxic if you drink too much. I personally avoid fluoridated toothpaste almost with a passion. The only time I use it is when I'm traveling or something and I run out of toothpaste and I can't find it, non-fluoridated toothpaste. So that's a recommendation for everybody. Now then, I've mentioned that the fluoride, the decay rates are diminishing throughout Western Europe and here in Canada and so forth. Now here's an article that relates to fluoridation. A fairly recent Journal of the American Dental Association 2001. There is an admission in an article in there that fluoride swallowed into the teeth is insufficient to have a measurable effect on reducing cavities. Now let's launch into the toxic parts. I think I've pretty well covered the science in the absence of any demonstrable benefit. No reduction in tooth decay caused by fluoridated water. Let's find out the other part of this talk or paper. What is wrong with fluoride? How does it hurt us? Well, I mentioned that fluoride is very toxic compared to lead and comparable to lead and arsenic. Now think of it this way. The recommended levels for exposure to lead and arsenic are 15 parts per billion for lead and 40 parts per billion, I believe it is, for arsenic. If you take the recommended maximum exposure that we get on our toothpaste or in water and so forth, that's in parts per million. So in Wichita, if we're going to get 0.7 of a parts per million, you need to multiply that by 1,000 to get it to parts per billion, to compare it to two equally toxic poisons. Well, all of a sudden, you've got 700 parts per billion in your toothpaste or in your city water supply, which is 15 or 20 times higher than some other really bad toxins. So it's very, very toxic, and we're getting way overdosed on it. At the end, if I have time, I'll read you a brief list of some areas where you'll get exposed to fluoride, whether you like it or not. So, okay. Now then, how does fluorides work? Why are they so toxic? Well, it turns out that fluorides bind very readily to proteins, enzymes, and DNA, which is amino acid, part of proteins. And it does this by forming a hydrogen bond to various constituents in the enzyme protein molecules. That bond is so strong that it's the second strongest chemical bond that we've identified. It just grabs on and it won't let go. And even if the cell that it's onto dies, it could still possibly be reincorporated into the body. That makes it very hard to get rid of fluorides. Fluorides accumulate in us, but there's really no good way to get rid of them. You know, we can talk about chelating the calcium or heavy metals in patients with heart disease and strokes and so forth, or patients with exposure to various toxic metals. And we use EDTA, and there are a number of other agents that can be used to remove toxins, but none of them affect fluoride. The fluoride just ignores it. It hangs on for dear life, and there's no way that we can reduce fluorides in the body. The only thing you can do is reduce your exposure and just hope you wait long enough for some of the fluoride to get out. Since the fluoride binds to enzymes so tightly, it works some mischief on those enzymes and actually changes the molecular configuration. And this makes those enzymes ineffective. They lose their effectiveness even at low levels of fluoride exposure by 50%, say. Well, this slows down all the metabolic processes in the body. I've read different numbers, but the number I stick to, or easiest to remember, is that there are over 100 identified enzymes that are attacked by fluorides and result in mischief throughout the body. Some of the organs affected, which I'll come back in some detail about it on the nervous system, but the central nervous system, the heart, the lungs, the skin, the bones, ligaments, tendons, almost anything, kidneys, thyroid, almost any organ system in the body that you can think of has an enzyme that is inhibited by fluorides. That's why they're not good enough for us, not good for us. And incidentally, all of these studies have been based on 1 part per million or less to do the enzyme studies. Now, these are some of the enzymes that I was able to find information on. At the top, it says acetylcholinesterase. That's important in nervous system function and a neurotransmitter. Glutamine, vital in the health of both the brain and the intestinal tract. DNA, you all know about DNA and inherit. DNA is kind of part of what becomes a gene and is vital for us. And so at 1 part per million, you can see the activities of these enzymes were reduced by from 50 to 100%. So that shows you the effect. The counter-argument against that was, well, but the exposure to fluorides is so low that you never get high values in the organs study. They'll always be real low. So here's a study that shows on the left column, it shows the concentrations in the organs before fluoridation. And then in the right column, and this is clear back from 60 to 65, it shows vastly increased levels of fluoride way above the 1 part per million level in the organs themselves. Now, then, what are some of the other mischievous things that these fluorides do to us that we can really recognize and talk about, perhaps? I've got a slide that's going to come up at the end here, but it's of a lady. It has a woman's face, and on the right side, she's nice, smooth skin. On the left side, she's all wrinkles. Well, guess what? Fluorides interfere with 2 amino acids that are involved in the production of collagen, which supports our skin. Our bones are made of collagen, which is mineralized. And it's been found that the hydroxyproline and hydroxylysine both are diminished by fluorides, and so you can't make the collagen you need to prevent the wrinkles, to have healthy joints, tendons, bones, and so forth. Can't do it. So girls, stay away from fluoride. I might add also that, remember Dr. I can't think of his name right now, but he was a Nobel Prize winner, and he found that lysine and proline have another attractive action in the body. They actually block cell receptors that allow small molecules of low-density lipoprotein to bind to the cell and enter into the cell. So that's a way of treating arteriosclerosis. And we actually have some tablets in our Dome 1 which take that into cognizance, and they've got the correct amounts if you take the full dose of proline, lysine, and vitamin C. Incidentally, this is from the physician's desk reference and the United States Pharmacopoeia, and both contain statements saying that if you drink 1 or 2 pints, I believe it's pints, of water per day in a city that's fluoridated at 1 part per million, you've hit your max. You go above that, you're in trouble. So people often have tried to say, well, you know, you'll never get enough water to hurt you. Well, you can pretty easily. And then they say, well, yeah, but people sweat a lot more. Well, the fluoride, about 70% of the fluoride you take in is going to be retained by the body. So you're just in trouble. No matter what angle you take on it, you're going to be in trouble with fluorides. Other bad effects, think of this. I think I've got this on a slide. Yeah, this is a slide demonstrating DNA strands. DNA is your hereditary information. The normal strands are straight, as shown in the top 2 railroad track type things, and you can see the hydrogen bond between the strands of DNA. And now you've probably seen DNA in another picture which shows these are twisted molecules, but this is how they look flattened out. And in the bottom 2, you can see the disruption and the change in form of the DNA, and those are where fluoride ions have gotten in there and pushed the hydrogen out of the way and taken their spot. Okay, so DNA is not good. I mean, bad DNA is bad, let's put it that way. What about cancer? Could fluoride have an effect on cancer? Well, absolutely can, as it turns out. This study shows, and do we have a pointer anywhere? Here I'm operating at half speed.
Right there, that button on the right.
Okay, here we go. This part of the graph shows the circles and the darkened, filled-in circles almost identical. And that's the cancer rate prior to 1952. If you go up to 1952, the cancer rate for the dark circles proceeds right on up. That's the fluoridated cities. And the cancer rate for the non-fluoridated cities stays approximately the same. There are dozens of studies showing that same effect. Ah, there she is. That's talking about the collagen. Now in bone, it's particularly interesting, the cancer effect. It's not really a cancer of frequent occurrence, but osteogenic sarcoma of the bone is a highly malignant tumor, usually treated, and generally when successfully treated, not always, but usually, necessitates amputation of an extremity. The rate in boys, 25 and under, in fluoridated cities is 5 to 7 times greater than the rate of that same tumor in non-fluoridated cities. There's a Dr. Burke, I think it is, did a large study on cancer, and he found that according to his calculations, 50,000 extra deaths per year occur in the United States in cities having fluoridated water supplies. And of that 50,000, 20,000 are cancers, 10 to 20,000. So no matter how you look at it, experimental animals, I don't think I have that slide, but on experimental animals, they've studied rats, and at low concentrations and low time, there's just hardly a budge in the occurrence of cancer. But boy, as soon as you go up in concentration above 0.1 parts per million, that's the low, the cancer rate just skyrockets. That's in rats. It's interesting to study in rats because they metabolize, they have a shorter lifespan. So you get the results from your experiments a lot faster. Now, fluorides that I haven't mentioned. Well, I mentioned a little bit, but fluorides are bioaccumulative. You can't get rid of them. So as you go through life, even though you're only getting a small amount, like in Wichita, 0.3 of parts per million, you're getting a larger and larger dose exposure. Central nervous system, what difference could that make? Well, have you ever heard of Alzheimer's disease? Fluorides are a neurotoxin. So they may be responsible for the increasing rates of Alzheimer's disease. And one interesting study shows that fluorides increase the concentration, increase the absorption of aluminum 500 to 700%. It goes way up when you've got fluorides in compounds that contain aluminum. I'm sure many of you probably switched from using aluminum pots and pans because of the aluminum question. In people with Alzheimer's, there are significantly increased deposits of aluminum in the hippocampal gyrus, it's called. And they call them neurofibrillary tangles. And when you look at those under the microscope, it just looks like a nest of hair or something because the fluoride is hanging on to all those particles. However, I'm not trying to tell you that aluminum is the cause of Alzheimer's. I'm just saying it's suspicious. It's unproven. Now this gets me into something I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I'll probably end with this. But this relates to our good old University of Kansas. I've already talked about Ottawa, now I get to talk about Lawrence, Kansas, I guess, or really it's KU Medical Center. But back in I think it was in the 60s or 70s, a graduate student showed up. She was a girl born in Missouri. Name is Phyllis Mullenix. And she was working on a doctorate degree in pharmacology. So she was in the pharmacology department at the KU Medical Center. And she had with her, even before she came, people recognized that there was something special about her and that she really, when she got hold of something, it was like a dog with a bone. You just couldn't get it away from her. So at any rate, in their pharmacology doctorate candidates, they tended to rotate through all the various departments, laboratories. And her first laboratory assignment was with Dr. Norton, Strata, I think it is, Stata, S-T-A-D-A, Stata Norton. At that time, she was recognized as the leading female toxicologist in the United States, way ahead of her time. And Dr. Norton wrote later, she said, Phyllis arrived in my laboratory to do a short project and she never left. But at any rate, there was Phyllis working away, and Dr. Norton's claim to fame, or her first really significant work, was in neurotoxicology. And she had observed that rats exposed to chemical toxins tended to eat and drink at the same time every day. And she could not figure out, she was thinking like, can they read the clock or something? You know, how do they know? Well, then she went deeper into it and did more watching of rat behavior, and it turns out that the rats had a behavioral pattern, neurobehavioral pattern, which was repeated day after day after day, and it's the same sequence. And when they got to the end of whatever it was, maybe scratching their left ear, then it was time to eat. So that's why they were so able to accurately time their eating. And Dr. Mullenix then, Phyllis picked up on that, and she said, gee, we can't watch these rats 24 hours a day, and we may be missing things because we don't have the sensitivity to see them. So she worked with a guy who had a grant for computer studies at Iowa State University, and they came up with a very, very complex program to monitor the behavior of rats just 24 hours a day. And lo and behold, they found that they could not only, they had increased sensitivity, they could pick up things that weren't picked up by the human observer, but reproducibility, and of course it saved money over the long haul. It was just everything good. Well, she got famous. And her journey then, we're talking about Dr. Mullenix now, her journey then proceeded through Johns Hopkins and Harvard, and she ended up at a place called Forsyth Dental Laboratories in Boston. And the guy that hired her as her first assignment said, well, we want you to study the effect of fluorides on the central nervous system. At that time, it was not known that fluorides were toxic to the central nervous system. So against her good judgment, I guess, she did. And they did 100 rats, and by George, there was obvious neurotoxicity, and they thought there must be a mistake. They did another 100, same thing. They ended up testing 600 rats, and every experiment showed neurotoxic effects from very low levels of fluoride. Through all this study, there was a gentleman, Harold Hodge, who was a retired scientist, had worked in the Manhattan Project for the U.S. government, and he came in every day, put on his white coat. He had white hair, pretty nice guy, I think. Came in and observed, and he always was asking Phyllis. She wrote about this. He just asked questions all the time, and she liked him. They got along wonderfully well, but he was very probing questions. Well, when it came time to present her work, and by this time Dr. Hodge had died, she presented it to the United States Public Health Systems and the CDC, or two different federal bureaus. And she expected they would be really interested and applaud her result. And she said at the end of each presentation, it was just a silence. And she couldn't understand why. And then the development theories of conspiracy and things came out. Shortly after those presentations, Dr. Mullenix was fired from her job. Yeah. So it became more obvious. Now, the plot thickens a little bit. It turns out that Dr. Hodge, as I mentioned, had worked in the Manhattan Project. And some of his experiences included, well, at the time, when you make an atomic bomb, even to this day, a lot of fluoride is required. And I'm not a nuclear scientist. I don't know why, but it is. And it has to do with the uranium. So anyway, they had lots of uranium to get rid of, and they had to get a source of fluoride. So the government employed DuPont Laboratories to furnish them all this fluoride material that they needed to make the atomic bombs. And that was done in a city in New Jersey. Well, in the production of the fluorides, there was fluoride discharges. So it was going out in the water supply and in sewers and air. And pretty soon, the cows couldn't walk. The crops weren't growing. The people were dying and having, all kinds of arthritic and neurovascular problems and so forth. And the government, of course, realized that it was due to the fluorides, because that's all that was happening there. But nobody knew that and knew what the fluorides were being used for. So the government decided, well, if we can make these damages seem due to something else, we can save ourselves a lot of money and a lot of trouble. And they hired some very high-powered lawyers at the time. This was 1944, I think, by this time. They hired a guy whose salary was $750,000 a year, which now would probably be 10 times that. So it gives you an idea how much they paid. Really high-powered law firm. And the law firm then took the farmers and citizens took the government to court. But the defense was, well, this is part of a national war effort project, and it's classified information, and we can't answer the question about how much of anything is in there. So they were excused, and that was really that was part of the beginning of the cover-up. There's another interesting guy in this cover-up issue. His name is Edward Bernay, B-E-R-N-A-Y, N-A-Y-S, I think. He was hired about this time to promote the idea that fluoride is safe for everybody to take. Bernay was the nephew, well, he's dead now probably, but was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he was considered the original spin doctor. And he had the idea, you know, that you can sell, that there's a hidden kind of an underground power structure in the world. And if you can sell anything to the public, and once they buy it, you've got the power if you're that underground people. So that's part of the conspiracy and how that got started. In summary, do y'all remember when the Corvair automobile was under the microscope and said to be unsafe at any speed? Well, I would like to say fluoride is unsafe at any concentration. So with that, I'll stop and certainly entertain questions. Oh, on the questions now, remember, if it's not a question, you're going to get the hook, and if you talk too long, you're going to get the hook.
Does fluorine the body?
Yes. Next. I'll get you. Okay. Well, oh, you're right. Excuse me. The question was, does fluorides or fluorine displace chlorine in the body? And the answer is yes.
In all these studies, was there anything studied towards the diet of these people, or the maintenance of their teeth, how well they took care of them, anything done on that along with the fluoride?
Yeah, the question is, in these studies, were other factors considered? I might sum them up of lifestyle, but that would include diets, most obviously, and even to maybe include what's in the water of the non-fluoridated, of either fluoridated or non-fluoridated city that might also reduce tooth decay. And the answer to your question is yes. They've looked very closely at dietary factors and nutrition, and actually socioeconomic class has a lot to do with tooth decay. And in a sense, that's one of the tragedies of water fluoridation, because we think we're helping, or most people think we're helping the underclass, let's say, by providing water that will prevent tooth decay. And you can see that in all of the publications locally that are promoting fluoride. But the truth of the matter is, it's not only not helping or making things worse, but they cannot afford to get away from the fluoride if it's in the water supply. Same thing with using fluoridated water to mix with the powders and make the bottle for the infants. They're getting a huge amount of fluoride that way. Just a minute. In back, this is Dr. Kalmeyer.
Did you say up to 2 pints per day was considered safe?
Well, yeah, of course that depends on the amount of water supply, but yeah, many of these studies have shown that 1 or 2 pints of water per day is not considered safe, but that reaches the maximum recommended. There's a maximum allowance. That's another whole story how they got there. One thing you might notice is, if you look at the history, the pediatricians and the dentists and the CDC and everybody has been gradually reducing what they consider the safe level of fluoride. It used to be 1 to 2. They got actually into an argument, and the ADA wanted to make it 8 parts per million, and the CDC said, or EPA, that we can't go over 4. So 4 is the maximum tolerable allowance, but it's way above what you should have. And they reduced the amount in city water supplies down to the point that they're recommending 0.7 now.
My question is, what about the absorption of fluoride in the skin of babies?
Yeah, that's a good question too. That question is, what about fluoride absorption to the skin? It is absorbed to the skin. And also, when you when you brush your teeth with fluoridated toothpaste, you may think that once you spit it out or rinse out, spit and rinse, that you're not getting any fluoride. That is not true. Fluoride is readily absorbed just like through the skin. It's absorbed through the lining of the mouth and very, very thin lining under the tongue of cells. And just think of, you've seen people taking nitroglycerin tablets for their heart, and they bite on a tablet, and within seconds they get relief. That's how fast that's absorbed.
Any studies been done on that? The absorption
There have been some studies. I don't have the data on them. Her question was, have any of those studies been done on the skin? And I know there have been. Let's get somebody. Yes, sir.
I got a question for you. I've got a pretty heavy-duty water filtering system for all the water I drink, and also filter for my shower, because I've been into clean water for years. If we wind up having fluoridation in the city, do you think that'll keep it out, or what's your opinion on that?
Okay, the question is, basically, can you filter fluoride out of your city water if we get it added to our water supply? Yes, you can. Some of the better reverse osmosis filter systems will remove fluoride up to, say, 70 to 90%, not all of it. There are distilled systems which virtually remove like 99 to 100% of the fluoride. Yes, sir.
How does fluoride have a negative effect on the thyroid? And how does that work?
Okay, his question is, how does the negative effect on the thyroid work? Actually, it works through the enzymes that are used to break down T4 and T3 at the cellular level.
But it does cause problems.
Yes, oh yeah, no doubt about it. It ruins the hormones. Yes?
Why is it that so many dentists are for fluoride?
Well, I kind of alluded to that a little bit when I talked about when you come out of medical school, most of the doctors lose their ability to think critically. They accept the dogma that's handed down to them from their professional societies. But I think there's more to it than that. The American Dental Association is known as one of the most effective lobbies in the United States, in Washington, D.C. And also they have one of the largest political action committee funds within that lobby. And they have been supporting fluoridation in conjunction with Alcoa, Procter & Gamble, and there's one other party in there. That's probably well, there's really just a triumvirate. The U.S. government, yeah, Alcoa and Procter & Gamble, they're actually two departments within the government that support it very strongly. So it's kind of a unholy trinity almost that has been promoting and brainwashing. And you know, the doctors are actually encouraged, you don't have to worry about reading the scientific papers. We'll tell you what's going on, and you can go to one source, get all the right information, and so forth. And that's the problem. More questions?
So are you insinuating that the ADA is being bought?
I don't think I'm insinuating. I think I'm saying it for sure. Yes?
Isn't it awfully expensive to add fluoride to the water?
Well, the cost of adding fluoride to the water is tolerable, particularly when you consider the number of people paying. In the Wichita area, we'd have at least 500,000 consumers, and it costs about $1 a year per consumer. Now, it's about $2.7 million to install the equipment, and I don't know about equipment maintenance, but at least $500 million a year to operate it.